When a biased cop performs a routine arrest, guided by his own prejudice, he never imagines the tables would one day turn on him in the courtroom. But what happens when the person he aimed to humiliate becomes a formidable symbol of justice? How does this face-off reshape his views, his life, and his core beliefs? Stick around, because this is a gripping tale of redemption and justice you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. Now, let's get into it. You think that just because you're driving a flashy car, you're untouchable? Officer Ben Carter's voice sliced through the crisp evening air, sharp and biting. His tone carried an air of superiority, his words dripping with disdain. Elise Bryant, seated calmly in her sleek vehicle, kept her hands firmly on the steering wheel. Her expression was a perfect mask of neutrality. She studied him closely as his face hardened, a faint smirk of authority curling at the edges of his lips, though there was something darker behind his eyes. License and registration now, he barked. Elise had already handed the documents over, but he wasn't paying attention. He flipped through them methodically, as though searching for something, anything, that would confirm the narrative he had already crafted in his mind. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elise asked, her voice even and measured. She spoke with a calmness that felt unsettling to Ben, far from the fear or desperation he typically expected. He had encountered countless drivers, and most, especially those who looked like Elise, reacted nervously. But this woman? She was different. "You're driving a car worth more than most people's homes," Ben snapped, folding his arms across his chest. "That's problem enough. Step out of the vehicle." Elise didn't move immediately. Her gaze locked on his, unwavering. "May I ask why?" "I've already complied with your requests. My license is valid. The car is registered in my name, and there's no apparent reason for this." Her tone was steady, firm, without crossing into aggression. Ben felt a surge of irritation rise within him. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this. There was something about her tailored outfit, her composed demeanor, that got under his skin. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he growled. "Am I under arrest?" Elise pressed, tilting her head slightly. Her voice wasn't antagonistic, but it wasn't submissive either. She spoke as though she already knew the answers. Ben clenched his jaw. Yes, you are." Before she could respond, he yanked the car door open. Elise stepped out gracefully, her movements deliberate and composed. She was taller than he expected, her presence commanding despite the cold steel of authority he wielded. Briefly, her eyes flicked to the dashcam on his patrol car before returning to meet his glare. "This is a mistake," she said simply. "Turn around." "Hands behind your back," Ben ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. Elise complied without hesitation. As the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists, she looked over her shoulder and said softly, "You have no idea who I am, do you?" "Does it matter?" Ben shot back, shoving her into the back seat of his car. He slammed the door and leaned against the vehicle, exhaling sharply. Her words stuck in his mind, buzzing like an unresolved question. At the station, Elise sat quietly in a holding cell. Her hands rested in her lap, her posture relaxed. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered faintly, and the faint aroma of stale coffee filled the air. Ben stood at a distance, watching her through the glass. She didn't look like someone who had just been arrested. Most people would seem shaken, even defeated, but Elise Bryant sat there as if she were waiting for a delayed flight at the airport. "Who is she?" Ben muttered to himself. Back at his desk, he flipped through her file again. Elise Bryant. No criminal record. A spotless driving history. An address in an affluent neighborhood. Doubt began to creep into his mind, uninvited but persistent. Then, his partner, Officer Ramirez, called out from across the room. "You sure about this one?" "I ran her. To be continued. Plates? Everything checks out." "This might not look great," Ramirez said, his tone cautious as he glanced at Ben. Ben bristled at the comment. "She was being uncooperative," he snapped, his frustration evident. Ramirez raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. "Uncooperative? She looks more like someone campaigning for office than a threat." Maybe let her lawyer deal with this before it blows up in your face. I've got it under control, Ben shot back, waving him off. But as he returned to his desk, Elise's words echoed in his mind. You don't know who I am. The next morning, Ben strode into the courthouse with his usual confidence. He was convinced he had handled everything by the book. To him, this was going to be a routine case. Elise would plead guilty, pay a fine, and that would be the end of it. But as he pushed through the double doors of the courtroom, something felt off. A low hum of murmured voices filled the space. People whispered in hushed tones, and many turned to steal glances at him. His stomach twisted uncomfortably. At the front of the courtroom, Elise stood, a stark contrast to how she'd looked the day before. Gone was the understated outfit. In its place, a sharp navy suit exuded authority, her hair neatly pulled back. She didn't look like a defendant anymore. She looked like she owned the room. What the hell? Ben muttered under his breath, his confidence faltering for the first time. Your Honor, Elise began, her voice commanding attention with every syllable. Before we proceed, I'd like to state for the record that I am a federal prosecutor, and I will be representing myself in this matter. Ben froze, the weight of her words hitting him like a freight train. The room seemed to collectively inhale as the judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Mrs. Bryant, this is highly irregular, the judge said, his tone a mix of surprise and curiosity. Elise offered a faint, polite smile. Yes, Your Honor. But given the nature of my arrest, I find it necessary to personally address the allegations and the conduct of the officer involved. Ben's heart thundered in his chest as the realization set in. This wasn't going to be a routine hearing. This was turning into his worst nightmare. Elise turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Ben's from across the room. For the first time, he noticed something in her eyes, not anger, not smugness, but something colder and far more deliberate. You've made a big mistake, Officer Carter, she said, her voice calm and steady. And today we're going to talk about it. The courtroom fell silent, every eye shifting to Ben. The weight of judgment settled over him like a heavy fog. Elise straightened her posture, her commanding presence filling the space. Your Honor, she continued, I intend not only to argue my innocence, but to shed light on a broader issue, one that this officer's actions represent. This isn't just about me. It's about systemic abuse of authority, and I request that this case be given the attention it deserves. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Ben felt the walls closing in on him. He sat frozen at the defendant's table, the confidence he had once carried now crumbling. This wasn't supposed to happen. People like Elise, calm, composed, and highly professional, weren't supposed to dismantle his actions so publicly, so decisively. The judge cleared her throat, her gaze thoughtful. Mrs. Bryant, I'll allow you to proceed, she said, her tone cautious yet intrigued. But I expect your arguments to remain relevant to the charges at hand. Elise nodded respectfully. Of course, Your Honor. She turned back to face the gallery. The courtroom was packed now, journalists, local activists, and curious onlookers who had caught wind of the high-profile defendant and her unusual decision to represent herself. Elise's presence was magnetic, her confidence unshaken. She began her case with the precision of someone who had lived and breathed the law for years. Every word was deliberate, every statement packed with impact. I was stopped without any clear reason, Elise said, her tone sharp and unyielding. Despite presenting valid identification and complying fully with the officer's requests, I was accused of resisting authority, a charge often used as a catch-all when no real crime has been committed. This isn't just about me. This is about a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. Ben shifted in his seat, the discomfort palpable. Every word she spoke felt like a dart aimed straight at his chest. He wanted to interject, to defend himself, but his attorney's warning replayed in his mind. Stay quiet. Speaking now will only make things worse. Elise continued, her voice unwavering as she laid out her argument. The room hung on her every word, her poise unshakable. For the first time in his career, Ben Carter felt truly powerless. The courtroom was thick with tension as Elise began pacing toward the jury box, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step deliberate. Her gaze swept across the room, and when she spoke, her voice carried a powerful conviction. "Your Honor," she began, her tone steady and commanding, "I've spent years prosecuting cases like this. I've seen firsthand how authority can be twisted and misused, and I've fought tirelessly against it. But yesterday, I found myself on the other side of that abuse. Today, I am here, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been unfairly profiled and made to feel less than human." Her words hit the room like a thunderclap, their weight undeniable. For the first time, Ben felt something shift inside him. The familiar walls of frustration and anger began to crack, revealing something deeper, something dangerously close to guilt. As Elise presented her evidence, her approach was calculated, almost surgical. There was no room for emotion, yet every word she spoke carried the force of someone deeply committed to justice. Witness after witness was called to the stand. Each testimony painted a picture of Officer Ben Carter's troubling pattern of behavior. A young black man in his 20s took the stand, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet pain that cut through the room. "Officer Carter pulled me over last year," he said, his words heavy with emotion. "He claimed my tail light was out, but it wasn't. Then he searched my car without asking. When I questioned him, he said, 'People like you are always hiding something.'" Ben's jaw tightened, his fists clenching under the table. He wanted to interrupt, to argue, to justify his actions. But his attorney leaned in and whispered sharply, "Keep quiet. The less you say, the better it is for you." During a recess, Ben found himself alone in the courthouse hallway, sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. The gravity of the situation pressed down on him like a crushing weight. Ramirez approached, his steps cautious as he sat down beside Ben. "How bad is it looking?" Ben asked, his voice low, his head still bowed. Ramirez hesitated, glancing around before answering. "It's not looking good, man. She's dismantling you in there, and she's got the evidence to back it up. Reports, witness statements, body cam footage. It's all there, Ben. And it's damning." Ben exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, though even he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. The words felt hollow, empty. Ramirez gave him a long, searching look. "Didn't you, though?" he asked softly. "Look, Ben, I've backed you up more times than I can count, but maybe it's time to take a step back and think. Why does this keep happening? You didn't see Elise Bryant as a person when you pulled her over, did you? You saw something else." Ben's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto Ramirez's. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Ramirez replied, his tone firm but not unkind, "that this isn't just about this one case. Maybe it's about how you see people like Elise, like that kid who testified earlier. Maybe it's time to look in the mirror." Back in the courtroom, the tension reached a boiling point. Elise presented the footage from Ben's dashcam. The video showed her calm demeanor throughout the interaction, a stark contrast to Ben's sharp, aggressive tone. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. Then came the moment that silenced the entire courtroom. Elise turned to address the court directly. She stood tall, her presence commanding. "This case isn't just about me," she declared, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about a culture that allows officers to act with impunity, especially toward people of color. Officer Carter isn't just an individual anomaly, he's a symptom of a much larger problem. And if we don't confront it, if we don't demand change, then we are all complicit in allowing it to continue." The gallery erupted into applause, the tension finally breaking. But Ben sat motionless, his mind racing. Elise's words were a mirror, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth about himself. He thought about all the times he'd acted on instinct, on a gut feeling, and how many of those decisions might have been influenced by his own biases. For the first time, Ben wondered, what if I was wrong? The case's climax came when the judge called for closing statements. Elise stood, her voice unwavering as she delivered her final argument. "I'm not here to seek revenge," she began, her words cutting through the silence. "I'm here to demand accountability. to demand that we do better, not just as individuals, but as a society. Officer Carter's actions weren't just about me. They represent a system that has failed too many for far too long. We have to be better than this. As she finished, the courtroom erupted again, the applause filling every corner of the space. Ben felt the collective weight of judgment pressing down on him. He sat frozen, knowing that the judge's decision would determine his fate. Yet, deep down, he realized the real judgment had already been passed by Elise, by the courtroom, and perhaps, finally, by himself. The judge returned to her bench, her face grave as she reviewed the evidence and testimony. The room fell into a heavy silence, every eye fixed on her as she prepared to deliver the verdict. Judge Morrison's voice filled the courtroom, clear and steady. After reviewing the evidence, it's apparent that this case extends far beyond a single traffic stop. It highlights systemic issues of bias and misconduct within law enforcement. She paused, letting her words resonate before continuing. Officer Carter, the judge said, her tone sharp and unyielding, this court will refer your actions to the department's internal affairs for a comprehensive investigation. Additionally, I strongly recommend mandatory bias training for not just you, but your entire precinct. The words landed with the finality of a gavel strike, echoing through the courtroom. Ben Carter sat motionless, his face pale, unreadable. The low murmur of the gallery grew louder as the weight of the decision settled over the room. Turning to Elise Bryant, Judge Morrison's voice softened slightly. Miss Bryant, I commend your courage and professionalism in bringing these critical issues to light. You have conducted yourself with grace throughout these proceedings. I hope this case serves as a catalyst for meaningful change. When the court adjourned, the courthouse lobby was a mix of tension and relief. Reporters swarmed Elise, their cameras flashing, microphones extended toward her. She stood poised, her composure unshaken as she fielded their rapid-fire questions. This isn't about me, Elise said, her voice rising above the clamor. It's about accountability, about ensuring that the systems designed to protect us truly serve everyone equally. I'm grateful the court took this matter seriously, but this is only the beginning. Ben watched from a distance, his stomach churning. Ramirez stood beside him, arms crossed, his face a mask of contemplation. You've got a long road ahead, Ben, Ramirez said after a moment, his voice low. You can't keep running from this. Ben swallowed hard, unable to respond. Instead, he took a deep breath and started walking toward Elise. She noticed him before he reached her, her posture stiffening, her guard instinctively rising. Elise, he said awkwardly, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. Can I have a word? The reporters paused, their curiosity piqued, but Elise raised a hand, signaling them to give her space. She nodded curtly and stepped a few feet away, just out of earshot of the crowd. What is it, Officer Carter? She asked, her tone clipped but professional. Ben hesitated, searching for the right words. His palms felt clammy, and his throat was dry. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he stammered. Elise tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Sorry for what? Ben's face flushed. He took a shaky breath. For everything. For how I treated you. For making assumptions. He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. For being part of the problem. Elise studied him for a long moment, her arms crossed. Do you even understand what you're apologizing for? She asked pointedly. Or are you just trying to save face? Her words stung, but Ben nodded slowly. I'm starting to. I know I've got a lot to learn and a lot to unlearn, actually. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating. Finally, Elise sighed. Apologies are a start, Officer Carter. But they don't mean much without action. Change isn't just about saying you're sorry. It's about proving it. I will, Ben said earnestly. I know I've got work to do, and I don't expect you to believe me right now. But I will. Elise didn't respond immediately. She nodded slightly, then turned and walked away, leaving Ben standing alone, the weight of her words pressing on him like a leaden cloak. Weeks later, in a modest community center downtown, Ben sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. The group was diverse, People from all walks of life, many of whom he knew he would have ignored or judged in the past. The facilitator, a young black woman named Maya, smiled warmly as she addressed the group. "Welcome to the first session of our anti-bias training," she began. "This is a space for reflection, growth, and accountability. Let's start by introducing ourselves and sharing why we're here." When it was Ben's turn, all eyes turned toward him. His throat felt dry, and he cleared it awkwardly before speaking. "I'm Ben Carter. I'm a police officer, and I'm here because I've made a lot of mistakes. I've hurt people, and I need to figure out how to fix that." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Maya nodded, her expression kind but firm. "Thank you for your honesty, Ben. Acknowledging the problem is the first step." Meanwhile, Elise continued her work tirelessly, using her newfound platform to advocate for systemic police reform. She spoke at public forums, appeared on national news programs, and met with lawmakers to push for tangible solutions. Her name became synonymous with change, though she was acutely aware of how much work lay ahead. One evening, after a particularly draining meeting with a community advocacy group, Elise returned to her office. In her mailbox was a plain envelope with no return address. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of what she might find. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Elise, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know your words didn't fall on deaf ears. I've started attending anti-bias training and working with community leaders to understand the harm I've caused. I know it's not enough, but I'm trying. Thank you for holding me accountable. You didn't have to, but you did. It's made me see things I should have seen long ago. Ben Carter." Elise folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't know exactly how to feel. Relieved, perhaps, that he seemed to be making an effort, but cautious. Change didn't happen overnight, and one man's journey was just a small part of a much larger fight. Months later, the ripples from Elise's case continued to spread. The police department implemented new training protocols, and a civilian oversight committee was established to handle allegations of misconduct. Progress was slow, but it was progress. One evening, Elise stood on the courthouse steps, the city skyline glowing softly behind her. She scrolled through an email update from a local advocacy group and allowed herself a small smile. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. Across the city, Ben stood in front of a newly painted community mural on the precinct building, a vibrant depiction of justice, unity, and hope. He traced the lines of the artwork with his eyes, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. He wasn't the same man who had sat in that courtroom months ago. He didn't know if he could ever fully atone for his past, but he was determined to spend the rest of his life trying. As the sun dipped below the horizon, two very different people reflected on their intertwined paths. Elise and Ben, once adversaries, were now bound by an unspoken understanding. Justice wasn't a destination but a journey, one they were both still walking.